Okay. So as people are starting to pop in, I wanted to thank you all for joining us for our IC Talk today. My name is El Tusi, the co-chair of the International Community for the Society of Professional Journalists. We appreciate those of you that are tuning in and taking the time to join our session. And before we get started with our guest today, I wanted to make sure we go over a few of our housekeeping items. Today's talk is a conversation with a guest and myself. I'll be taking questions during the talk. So if you have a question, please make sure to pop that into the Q&A portion. We will unmute you and you can ask your question directly. If you prefer me to ask the question for you, I'm more than happy to do so. Just make a note of that so that I can do that for you. Please leave the chat section for any technical questions, links, or anything that you'd like to add to the conversation in real time. As a matter of fact, if you'd like, you can let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat section. And my co-chair, Dan Kubisky, he's going to keep an eye on that for us. So let's get started. We have the pleasure of having New York Times reporter Jere Longman with us today. He's been a sports reporter for the New York Times since October of '93, covering a variety of international sports, primarily those of the Olympics. He's written about sexual and psychological abuse of young female athletes in various sports during the span of his career. That includes fencing and synchronized swimming just this year. I've had the honor and pleasure of working with him on a story about the sexual abuse of female athletes in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu not too long ago. Jere also noted that he has reported from more than 50 countries, and I'm certain that one conversation with him is not going to be enough time to talk about all the stories and experiences he's had over the span of his career. And man, we're going to try to do our best today. So Jere, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me, El. Appreciate it.
So it kind of makes sense. How about we start from the very beginning?
Sure.
What got you into journalism?
So I grew up in a small town in Louisiana, and town of 10,000 people. And one of the things I always wanted to do was see the world. I had a yearning from, fourth grade geography to my brother used to receive a renewed subscription every Christmas to National Geographic. And I don't know if he ever read it, but I did. So, this was a chance for me. I thought that being a sports writer, I would get to travel and see the world. And that's what I wanted to do. So essentially my career has been 45-year extension of fourth grade geography.
I love that. And so when you first got into journalism, what was the trajectory of your career from your first job into where you are now at the New York Times? What did that look like?
So I attended at Louisiana State University, and I got a degree in journalism. Then I graduated in 1976. Then I worked in Jackson, Mississippi for a year, in Dallas for 5 years at the Dallas Times-Herald, which unfortunately no longer exists. Then 11 plus years at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and then the last 28 years at the New York Times.
That's incredible. And so a lot of the times with people that tune into our talks are journalists from all different parts of their career, whether they're starting out, mid-career, or veterans. I wonder, with your experience, what kind of tips do you have for journalists that are just starting out, if they're thinking about covering sports or whatever it may be? Like you mentioned, you want to see the world, right? What tips would you give them now if they're looking to get into journalism and to kind of pursue something similar to what you've done?
There's a lot of people say, well, you shouldn't get into journalism now. The jobs are contracting and stuff, but I say the opposite. The people getting into the business now are the people who will be riding the crest of whatever technological wave plays out in the coming years, and or the best prepared, far better than me, to be prepared to handle whatever is playing out. The other thing I always say is make sure you get paid. Don't do things for free. Unfortunately, the value of the written word has been devalued, and people now want you to work for little or nothing. And I understand maybe you have to try to do that at some point to establish your name, but resist that as much as possible, because your work is valuable, it's your profession, and make sure you're rewarded for it.
Right. That's such a great tip to give to those that are starting out? Because, a lot of times folks or those that are starting out will do internships or things to get experience, or that's how it's promised them. Well, you'll get a byline. So,
And the other thing I would say is, so much now with social media, which I have to confess, I'm not on social media, which I'll admit makes me a dinosaur. But it's not all just opinion. That you have to go out and do the reporting. You have to be, you always have to go out there, get your feet on the ground where you're going, always make the next phone call. That's what will keep the legitimacy of the business is the reporting, and people can count on that you're doing fair, accurate, and persistent and resolute reporting. That you have to actually go out and report. It can't be just giving your opinion. I mean, if the business is going to survive, the journalism business, there has to be going out and doing the reporting. And I have to say off the top, I'm very fortunate to work at an organization like the New York Times that still has the resources and the determination to send its reporters all over the place to get the story.
Right. And so I noticed that you've written 2 books, one about the women's soccer team and another one about 9/11.
Right.
So was during the duration of your career, were you just focused on sport, or have you covered other beats and topics, and how were you able to kind of maneuver that to get in?
Yeah, so I've actually written now 6 books, but so most of them have been, well, just about all of them have been sports books, except for this 9/11 book. So I'm based in Philadelphia. I've been at the Times, as I said, for 28 years, but I've never lived in New York. I've continued to live in Philadelphia, where I worked previously. And the Times doesn't care. It has reporters all over the country and the world, as long as you're willing to do the work and travel.
Right.
So, because I live in Philadelphia, when 9/11 happened, United Flight 93 crashed in Western Pennsylvania in Shanksville. So I was sent out by the paper to cover it, because all the roads and bridges and tunnels were being closed in New York City. And once we realized this other plane had crashed, they said, go. And so I went and covered it, and then wrote a book about it. But it's called Among the Heroes, about United Flight 93. But so, I mean, when I worked in Texas, in Dallas, I did a lot of news side reporting. I covered schools, the Dallas school district. I had a job where I traveled around the state writing, features that were not sports features, but news features. But most of my career has been in sports.
Amazing. What kind of tips would you give to journalists that are covering beats that can transition that into you have a New York Times bestselling book. So what kind of things should they think about if they're covering a certain beat or subject matter to make that successful in the publishing world? How would they approach that?
So there's an old saying that everybody has a book in them, and that's where it ought to stay. But I think the opposite. I think everyone has a book in them, and that you never know what kind of subject will be turned into a big bestseller. I guess just I mean, depending on what you want to do. I mean, your first obligation is to your beat in your newspaper, but right. There are many subjects that you can develop into books on almost any subject. I mean, I forget his name now, Dan, I forget his last name, but he was a columnist at the Philadelphia Inquirer and then wrote a book about his dog, Marley and Me, and it became, one of the biggest bestsellers of the late 20th century. So, I mean, any subject, it could be about corruption in the city you work in, or just some, a big personality you meet, or a doctor or scientist who's making a discovery. I mean, it could be on almost any topic. So that's you just have to get beyond the newspaper story, dive deep into it, and stick with it, and spend months or a year or more, and then you can do it. So every journalist, I always say it this way. So there are 300 words on a page, and any journalist can write 1,000 words a day, right? So you do the reporting, and if there are 300 words on a page and you write it 3 pages a day.
Right.
And you know, in a
Just
couple
making it
months,
manageable,
you
right?
have the first copy, you have the first, you know, first sort of draft of a book if you stick with it. I mean, obviously nobody really wants to write a book that quick, but it can be done, and journalists are trained to write that fast, and so you know, these things appear overwhelming until you begin them, but then once you do it, and as long as you stick with it, I'm really bad with procrastination and generally, but when I write a book, I stick with it because that's the, you know, it keeps it from becoming overwhelming.
Right. Right. Making it manageable, breaking it down. And
you just have to do it. I mean,
so Jere, when you got into journalism or even now, do you have any mentors or other journalists that you look up to or admire in the work that they do?
Yeah, I mean, you know, many of my colleagues I'm very impressed by. I've never really had a mentor that I've, like, through the years that I have, you know, have really been in contact with all the time and things like that. But I read voraciously, and I learn constantly from my colleagues, my editors at the Times. But no, I've never really had one particular mentor through the years.
And so this year was a big year with sports, right? With the Olympics. And I know I've been talking to someone telling them, you know, it wasn't until the Jiu Jitsu story that I found out when you were telling me that there's cases of abuse in so many different sports across the gamut,
Yeah,
right?
it's a sad but true statement that so what happens is, especially in these sports that are sort of Olympic related, there's nobody really over these governing bodies. There's no oversight. And so what happens often is that these organizations reflexively protect themselves instead of the victims of sexual abuse. So it's obviously the most visible case has been the horrific abuse of female athletes in the United States gymnastics team. So Simone Biles and other athletes were abused by this doctor, Larry Nassar, for years. And his abuse was so pervasive and furtive, even, that sometimes the gymnast mothers would be in the examining room and didn't know what was going on. So, you know, these but what happened was the United States Gymnastics Federation basically tried to cover it up so they wouldn't lose funding. And they even convinced the FBI not to look into this, in a very resolute way. So that's very troubling. But all these, I mean, as you said, just this year I've written about basketball, fencing, psychological abuse, even in synchronized swimming of all sports. And then we just did our jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu is not an Olympic sport, but it's a sport where the teachers, these black belts, are seen as demigods, and they hold a lot of sway over young women. And the nature of the sport, this close quarter training, that barrier between the physical barrier between coach and student doesn't exist. And so,
with a lot of the sports, right?
Yeah, a lot of them, unfortunately, and young women who are trying to succeed in the sport often fall prey to these older guys who are grooming them. And it's really a sad story, and it's just never ending. I mean, one of my colleagues wrote a story about dragon boat racing. I mean, who would have thought, and where there was abuse. And I heard today there was an abuse story broke about in the National Hockey League, I think. I was just told about it, but I heard that there might have been a story breaking today about it. I'm not sure. I don't have the details.
Right. And so, as like a journalist, this is my first experience covering sport and sexual abuse in a sport. And so I didn't know what to think going into it. However, I've covered and talked to victims of abuse, and, how do you prepare yourself? Or is there like a formula to how to approach these stories so that you don't emotionally break down from hearing all the victims telling you their side of the story? Like, how do you approach it as a journalist when you are covering these types of stories?
So I think there has been a real change in recent years that just as with abuse of any kind, you know, people are generally reluctant to come forward because their reputations are going to be challenged, and it just makes it difficult. But now these, athletes are not willing to be quiet anymore. They're willing to stand up, and I think, as somebody as well known and successful as Simone Biles speaks up, and just happened in soccer, where in the National Women's Soccer League, two former players stood up, including one of them who was a high school classmate of my daughter in Philadelphia, stood up and said, "We're not taking this anymore." So I think that in many ways makes it easier on the journalists, because women want to tell their stories. So I mean, you have to speak to speak respectfully, and you just sort of, my approach has always been to sort of just kind of lead the conversation lightly and let people tell their stories, right? So in this jiu-jitsu story, the young women we talked to for this jiu-jitsu story, they wanted to tell their stories. Right. And two of the three of them wanted their names used. So they were almost demanding that we talk to them, right? Right. So I think that's been a big change
How common is that? Are you seeing that more recently? Like with the jiu-jitsu story, like you said, two of the three wanted their names to be used. They want their stories to be told. But I imagine in other stories, that's kind of like an obstacle, isn't it?
It's so when I did this fencing story, women were reluctant to use their names. But this synchronized swimming story we talked to 50 athletes, I think, from 16 countries, and they all wanted their names used. Wow. So I think, once a critical mass is reached, would you lose this kind of fear of coming forward? So you just have to approach it respectfully, and as a journalist, you always have to have some skepticism, but you have to let the people tell their stories, and then you try to corroborate what they're saying. And there, so in this jiu-jitsu story, there were documents, right? So there were police documents, there were, interviews, emails, and both stunning to you and me was the fact that everybody was talking about this via social media, via Instagram, right?
Yeah, that's where I found the story. Yeah. It was on social media. That's so wild.
So in that way, so you have more than just a she said, he said, she said kind of story. There are in many of these cases there are documents. So that's what you always do. Talk to victims, talk to their attorneys. Their attorneys will often speak. And prosecutors will often, they wouldn't speak to us in this jiu-jitsu case, but often they do. They want to talk, and defense attorneys want to talk, and you can get documents. I mean, you online, you got documents from Florida. One of the teenage victims that we read about, her father, I tried but couldn't get the police report because she's a juvenile, so he went and got it for me. So you just you ask, there'll be people to help you out. You just have to keep asking, and I always say, make the next phone call, because you never know what'll happen.
Right. And that's going to be my next question to you, because this ended up being a story. When I first read the documents, when I saw that on social media, I requested the documents from the person who had them all. And when I went through, I thought, I can't do this on my own, because it involves someone in Morocco, potential something in Brazil, cross borders, right, in Florida, right, Texas, and here I am in California. And so when it comes to doing these kinds of international stories, during a pandemic, I'm sure you've done all these other stories are international stories. How do you approach that? And I know you have the support of the New York Times, but there is a different feel to it when you're able to be there in person. Am I right? Or
sure. So again, I'm the New York Times has bureau. So this Brazilian jiu-jitsu story, the New York Times has a bureau in Rio de Janeiro. So they provided us with a stringer who did incredible reporting and got a police report from 5 years ago, and talked to the police chief from this case, and interviewed people in Brazil and Portuguese. So that all you can't sort of underestimate how much that really helps. And then you have to, as I said, I've reported from more than 50 countries. I did a story in Brazil, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, on the beheading of a soccer referee in the middle of nowhere in Brazil. There was like a pickup match, and it got out of control, and a referee stabbed the player, and then the player's friends retaliated and beheaded the referee. And so the Times sent me there. And so we showed up. I worked with another stringer from the Times Rio Bureau.
Right.
And, she spoke fluent Portuguese, and we went to this little town, and it was 6 months later, and everybody talked. We even got into the prison to talk to 2 of the 4 men who had been accused of beheading the referee, or, helping participate in it.
And they even spoke to you?
And they spoke to us.
Wow.
And so, yeah, and so, I mean, obviously not everyone has a chance to go around the world, but you do have a chance in your city, or, your region or state or province to go and do it. I mean, just go talk, knock on doors. I mean, literally, and somebody will talk to you. I mean, that's a guarantee that somebody will talk to you. I'm working on a story now. I'm just starting to work on it, but it's
Oh, cool. Can you tell us about it, or is it?
Well, I can't say much because I'm just starting, but it was a murder that happened more than half a century ago. And working on it with a colleague, and we found some survivors and, family members. So we're starting to work on that. About this long ago murder, and we're just going to knock on doors and see what people will say. So that's what I recommend. The other thing, sometimes is also in these kind of cases, it doesn't hurt to wait. I mean, some of these stories you have to write on deadline right away. I mean, they demand it. If it's a well-known figure or something.
I kind of felt that with the Jiu Jitsu one too. There was like a time frame to introduce it.
Right. But there was but the stories had really broken in August, and we got onto it a few weeks later. Right. I did a story in Texas in June about a high school football player who had attacked a referee in a game in last December. He got thrown out of the game and then attacked the referee. And we waited 6 months, and the player talked about what happened. The referee talked about it. And this beheading story, we waited 6 months. So sometimes it helps to wait on these stories because, people are reflexively, don't want to talk at the beginning, you understand. But as time goes on, things loosen up and people want to talk. So it doesn't always hurt to wait a little bit, unless sometimes you can, but.
How do you know when to wait for it and when to approach it?
Well, if it's let's just say, if there's a big name athlete or something that does something right or wrong, or is accused of something, I mean, you often have to write that story.
Right
away. But if it's a lesser known athlete, or it's a trend you're writing about that doesn't have to be written about immediately, I mean, you can just tell. I mean, your editors will demand the story right away, or they may say, okay, we can wait. Let's take the longer look at this. I mean, and again, I'll say the Times is fortunate enough to have a huge reporting staff, so we can take the time. Not everybody has that ability, but I understand that. But if you do, sometimes it's good to step back a little bit, get the larger picture. That's one thing that Times always sort of hammers home, is to sort of, is there a broader story here than what you're writing?
So what would be your tip if someone's pitching to the New York Times? I mean, I think I got lucky. What's the right formula if they want to approach the Times with a potential, let's say, sports story?
Yeah, so it's always sort of, what is the bigger picture, I think. So, for instance, I have written since 2005 or so, a lot about hurricanes in Louisiana. After Hurricane Katrina, I spent most of 2 years in part of Louisiana writing a series of stories, then a book about this high school football team that was formed after Katrina from the destroyed little towns below New Orleans. And so that was a story about climate change, about how storms are getting bigger and more powerful. And so in August, when Hurricane Ida hit Louisiana, in Southeast Louisiana, it came 12 months after another major hurricane hit Southwest Louisiana. So instead of just writing about the hurricane, I wrote a broader story about how high school sports are showing Louisiana's challenges with climate change. That
Right.
with, that these little high schools are getting destroyed, and they try to build them 20 feet off the ground, and they try to remain on the coasts, but it becomes more and more difficult. So that's what I think at this moment the Times is interested in. If you pitch a story, at least in sports, which is what I know, is what's the bigger story? That's what the editors are keep asking. Can we broaden this? What's the bigger story here? Is this
Right.
part of something larger?
And I know earlier you mentioned the story in Brazil. I imagine that's probably one of the stories that sticks with you. I don't know if it's one of the most dangerous stories you've worked on, but is there like a most dangerous story you worked on, or a location you've been to that?
So, I always say I'm a sports writer, so the only shooting I usually see is free throws in a basketball game. So I have not been in war zones or anything. I can't pretend that. One time I've been to South Africa a few times, and I was there right at the end of apartheid, and in a few situations that got a little dicey, but I wasn't in really any serious danger. I did in the Soccer World Cup was held in Russia in 2018. So
Right.
I watched. So Russia and Eastern Ukraine are been having this sort of this war on the eastern border of Ukraine. So Russia
Right.
has annexed Crimea, and then they pushed into or at least Russian affiliated soldiers have pushed into eastern Ukraine. So I watched the opening match of that World Cup on the Ukraine side in a bunker on the border where they were. So we were in this military bunker. On one side of the bunker, there were two TVs in the bunker. One was showing the match, Russia and whoever they were playing, and the other was showing they were shelling, the Russian supported soldiers on the other side. So it made for we were never in any real danger or anything, but it was there was some fighting going on.
That's
so
wild.
They shepherded us in and out of there in an ambulance, like a big ambulance. And then at the end, after the match was over, they told us, all right, if you want to leave, you have to leave now. And they used the euphemistic term before the concert begins. So the big fighting starts at night. But I'm sure there are reporters on this chat who've been in far more serious situations than I have. The most interesting trip I probably ever made was I ran a marathon in North Korea in 2015.
What was that?
Why not? And so I cover running, or I have covered running throughout my career, and they have started a race there for amateur runners. And so I thought, well, why not? So there's a tour group in Beijing that's run by Brits. And many of them have made dozens or 100 trips into North Korea for various tours. And they say on their website, don't if you're a journalist, don't hide, and don't try to get into the country undercover, because you'll get in trouble and we will. So I just called them and said, I'd like to do this. And they said, sometimes we can get reporters in. So I think they had me listed when I got there as a sports tourism promoter. So whatever, I don't know how that happened. But anyway, it was Iran. It was, as you can imagine, fascinating. You spend your whole time there trying to determine what you're seeing, whether it's real or is it completely orchestrated. So
you could tell.
It's very hard to tell, and sometimes you just can't. So there's basically one tourist hotel in Pyongyang, the capital. They let you in the day before you fly in, and you can stay a couple of days afterwards. And then you're on the course. The race begins and ends in a stadium of 50,000 people, and they're clearly told to go there, because why else would they be there to watch people like me run a marathon? But on the course, so you saw soldiers high-fiving runners, and you don't know, was that was that a real spontaneous human interaction, or were they told to do that? I don't know. They, young kids would speak rudimentary English. So the capital is where the party loyalists live, and if there's a middle class, that's who they are. That's where they are. So I'm guessing they learn English in school there, and people seem supportive on the streets. They sometimes seem overly supportive. So again, you just keep asking yourself that question, and there's not an answer often. But it was, some people were friendly. I was running with these little gel packs to give you energy, and I was struggling to take the top off one, and a woman at a water station grabbed my gel and took a knife out of her pocket and cut the top off for me. And it was, she couldn't have been nicer. But the one thing about North Korea, there are no porta potties on the course like there are in, marathons in more developed nations. So if you leave, you have to go to the restroom, and you have to leave the course. So I didn't leave the course in that marathon, but other people did. And there was, so one restroom was in a karaoke bar, one was in an elementary school. So that made it, kind of interesting.
I mean, were there a lot of people from around the world at that marathon? I'm imagining it's a little bit harder for people to get in, right?
There were 800 runners. It's gotten bigger, I think, since then. There were 800 runners from a number of countries. There were some Americans. There were some Americans living in and outside of the United States. A lot of Europeans were there. That's what I think there were some Australians there as well. So that's who it was. So the race that was not held last year because of COVID, I'm not sure if it's being held this year.
Which makes
but
sense.
It was fascinating, probably the most fascinating trip I've been on. The other trip I really enjoyed was a year before the Berlin Wall fell. I went to East Germany in 1988 to what turned out to be the last East German athletics or track and field championships. And I always have I've covered the Olympics since 1988, so I've always been fascinated by these Eastern Bloc athletes, and so that to me was really a great trip.
Is there a country you haven't been to yet that you'd like to go to and report from?
I think I'd like to go to India to see it. I've not been to India. I had a trip planned a few years ago, and it was canceled at the last minute. I've not been to any of the former Yugoslav republics. I think I'd like to see that, at least a few of those. I've only been to Argentina and Brazil and South America, maybe, some other places. I basically would go anywhere. So I'm happy to see any country, but those are the ones that sort of immediately, come to mind.
And where do you get your inspiration, or where do your stories come from? I know you're here right now you're in Louisiana, but traditionally you're from Philadelphia.
So I think I try, and I think, most journalists are like this. You try to come up mostly with your own stories, so you're not given an assignment by an editor that you may not like or so. So I get them from many places. Just, they pop into my head, or I'm interested in a particular subject and start reading about it. Or I'm just reading by chance and I get an idea, and you might be reading a little tidbit in USA Today or something, a one-line little tidbit, and you think, whoa, okay, that could be a good story. I mean, you just never know where they come from. You could, it could be a subject you're interested in, and so you just start reading about it. And so I've sort of gotten interested in climate change. So I've got a bunch of ideas in my head that I now would like to write about, and I've started reading. We'll see how it goes. Right.
And so we do a lot of conversations about local stories and how they can connect to global stories, right? And vice versa. Global stories can make sense locally. I'm guessing you've had a lot of experience with that when it comes to the sports stories. Are there ones that kind of stick out for you that maybe journalists can be missing, that maybe they can pay attention to when it comes to approaching potentially a story they want to work on in sports?
Oh, in sports?
Or in general, I mean, if you have other recommendations, because I imagine right now people with coming out of a pandemic, or we're kind of still in a pandemic where traveling is so hard. So finding, those global stories when you're local, let's say you're in, in Ohio? Like, how do you find those global
So,
stories?
I mean, well, I think one story that is affecting everybody now is this sort of supply chain issue, right? I mean, this sort of global issue is got to be affecting everybody's hometown. I
Right.
mean, if you're having trouble getting, stuff at the grocery store or Walmart or whatever, I mean, that sort of all links into this huge international story. I mean, the COVID story, the vaccine story. I mean,
Right.
that's a local story with international ramifications. I mean, those two really come to the top of my head. I mean, so as far as a lot of my sort of local sports stories that are international become, or about athletes who are local, but then become Olympians and win medals, or, become known internationally like that. So, and then I'm lucky again at the time. So I'm able to go to other countries and write about local heroes who become world, renowned. Like, so the winner of the last two gold medals in Olympic figure skating is a man from Japan named Yuzuru Hanyu.
Mm-hmm.
And he's an incredible story. So I followed him around the world and to Russia and to Japan, and to see a country where he's so in the United States now, decades after the Tanya Nancy episode, the knee whacking of Nancy Kerrigan by associates of Tanya Harding, the sport has kind of lost some visibility. But, in a place like Japan, this guy, Yuzuru Hanyu, everywhere he goes, people are, they're throwing these little Winnie the Pooh dolls on the ice. And it has, because he's a fan of Winnie. I mean, like hundreds of them are just thrown on the ice. We went to some temples in Japan where it was a temple that sort of bore a name similar to his, where people are going and praying and wishing him well. And to me, that's fascinating to see how, to go to other cultures and see how athletes are viewed there. I've been to Ethiopia 4 times, where they have, some of the world's greatest distance runners, and it's fascinating to see how they are perceived in society and what running can mean for them in these, developing nations, or Kenya,
right,
places like that. Just sort of what in sports that are not the most popular sports in the United States, but in these other countries really can can change your life almost overnight. I mean, when a country where the average income is, hundreds or a few $1,000s a year, and you're a great marathon runner, you can make hundreds of thousands of dollars by winning the Boston Marathon, or the Olympic, or in prize money, not in prize money, by endorsement money by winning the Olympics. Those stories are fascinating to me, just to go to places and see runners living in these just isolated villages who become world renowned, at some point, and maybe become politicians, or, and how they use their fame and their wealth to help other people. To me, that's really fascinating.
What's your proudest moment as a journalist, whether it's a story or a particular person you've connected with? Do you have a proud moment of whether it's a particular story or person you've connected with?
No, I mean, the best work I'm sure I'll ever do is this book about United Flight 93. It was something out of my comfort zone. The FBI, the government officials, and I was a sports writer, and I didn't know if I could do it. My wife talked me and said, somebody has to write about these people. So basically, it turned out to be a book about everybody who's on the flight, all the passengers, and even the lead hijacker. I mean, I literally called, he was from Lebanon. I called directory assistants in Lebanon and got his uncle and his father on the phone. So that's probably the best thing I'll do. I have one moment, though, that I'll tell you. It's a funny story about how even the New York Times has its limits of influence.
Right.
So I was born July 17th, 1954, which is the same date that Angela Merkel was born. So, so I happened to be in Germany on July 17th, 2011 at the Women's World Cup soccer final. And I thought, all right, if I could ever play my New York Times card, this would be it. So I went up to the tournament organizers. We were in Frankfurt, Germany, and said, wouldn't it be great if a New York Times reporter who was born the same day as the chancellor wished her happy birthday, and we could laugh about how life takes its different paths. I became a sports writer. She became the head of her country. Wouldn't that be great? And he looked at me and he waved his finger in my face and said, "That's not going to happen." So even the New York Times has its limits of influence.
That is so funny. I mean, if you weren't working on, if you weren't a sports writer, was there another beat that you would have worked on that?
So I think for me, sort of international relations, and I would have maybe liked to become a foreign correspondent. I basically, through much of my, especially at the New York Times for the first 27 or 6 years that I was there, I was essentially a sports foreign correspondent. But maybe it would have been interesting to actually be based in a country for a long time. I mean, for various reasons, I didn't end up doing that. But I think,
Where
I think
you want to be based.
So, well, I would never complain about living in Paris, or Berlin is maybe my favorite European city, just because of the history, the Cold War history, especially, but also the World War II history. And then, I made a dozen reporting trips to Africa. So I think it would have been fascinating to maybe live in Africa for a while.
I know you worked on the story about the Mali basketball team, and it came up during the time we were reporting on the Jiu Jitsu story. What was that experience like covering that?
So I worked with a French reporter who basically he spends his whole career writing these kind of stories, and so that was a story that was difficult to do because there were no documents, because in a predominantly Muslim country, women have very few rights, and women there are few people looking out for them in a country like Mali, which is in West Africa. There are few laws to help to assist them, so there were no documents about women were either afraid to go to the authorities or just resigned to the fact that nobody would look out for them. So so we had to rely on just the testimony of women and again, people who were activists there, who were finally tired of this abuse, who've been going on for at least 2 decades or so. And our interest in the story was that the head of the World Basketball Federation, we were told by a number of people, knew about this because he was previously the president of the Mali Basketball Federation and their sports minister. So we were told that he knew, because everybody knew in the country, and but that he didn't do anything to stop it. He denied that to us. But we had some young women, again, I mean, they didn't want their names used, but they talked to us freely. Their father talked to us freely. These activists talked on the record. And then we had some people who had worked in Mali in sports that spoke using their names. But that was hard to do because, and also the conversations, Romain Molina, the reporter I worked with,
right.
So every conversation involved translation. So he was speaking in French to his contacts, who were then speaking in Bambara, the dialect of the young women who were in Mali. So there was a lot of translation going on. It took a while, several months, to get that story. And unlike the Jiu Jitsu story, there just weren't documents because and no, there was a separate investigation done by the World Basketball Federation, and they acknowledged that there was widespread abuse. So you take some satisfaction from that we did expose this widespread abuse going on there. I mean, these women were, they were forced. The coaches would force them to sleep with them or lose their place on the team. I mean, it was a brutal conditions. We had, one case where a coach impregnated a young athlete and forced her to get an abortion. I mean, just brutal conditions, and there was almost no recourse for women within the structure of society to get redress from this,
Wow.
which is sad.
I find that very surprising that it's still happening post the gymnastics stories that came out, that it's still happening, and I realize that with this jiu-jitsu story that it's prevalent, it's still happening, and I'm sure more people are going to come forward, right?
Yeah, and it's just, unfortunately, like the International Olympic Committee, they have these standards in place where we won't tolerate this and we're all inclusive, but nobody does anything to stop it. Nobody puts their foot down. And these sports organizations like, the International Basketball Federation, they have rules saying we won't tolerate this, but they don't follow the rules. And so, and often especially in the United States, where the problem has been as big as any other place. So all these sports federations were created at a time when sports were amateur. So since 1988, the Olympic sports have become professional. I mean, not everybody is a professional. Some of these kids are still in high school or college, but you can be a professional. But the people running these organizations are mostly amateurs, and they're volunteers, and they're not equipped to handle these situations. They're not professionals. And then there's this fear of tainting the sport or losing funding from sponsors, which sadly, becomes the primary thought, and nobody's looking out for the victims. And I don't know the answer except to keep reporting about it, and hopefully, Congress I just held some hearings about the gymnasts and stuff, but the gymnastics case happened before the last Olympics, so it's a slow moving thing. It's sad because while women are getting many more opportunities, for almost 4+ decades, almost 50 years after Title IX was passing, that barred that demanded gender equity in sports at institutions that receive federal funding. It's still going on, and it's happening in college, and I think it's just going to take. I think we're turning a corner. I hope, in a sense, that women are much more willing to speak out now.
Right.
There was a case at Louisiana State University, my alma mater, last year that USA Today did an outstanding job of reporting, where athletes were abusing other male athletes were abusing female athletes or female students. And even the coach was, one of a former football coach, Les Miles, was, basically telling people to hire only buxom blondes to be in his office. And then he was accused of some improper behavior. So even the coaches are doing this kind of stuff. So I think it's just going to take women, refusing to be silent, and reporters willing to keep writing about this. I think that's how you stop it.
So we have a question in from our current president of SPJ, Rebecca Aguilar. She says, he does not appear to slow down anytime soon. Will he ever retire, or is he the Leslie Stahl, the New York Times?
Well, I'm 67 now. It's a good question. I would, at this point, I say I don't want to work beyond 70, but I still feel, especially during the pandemic. I had nothing else to do. I couldn't go anywhere. I might as well keep working. But and again, I'm fortunate to be at a place like it's the New York Times that will send you to places and send you to travel and let you, if you have an idea, you ask them and they may say yes. All they can do is say no. So I don't know. It's a good question, and I wrestle with this all the time. But I'm by far the oldest person in the sports section at the New York Times. So, I'll be facing that kind of career mortality sometime soon. But I hope not to go beyond 70. But, if I still feel good when I'm 70 and I can still write good stories and I'm still curious, then maybe I'll keep going.
Well, I have to say, having the honor of working with you, it was so refreshing for me because I come from a different world. And so, being able to have that experience, to know how fast paced it can go and how quickly you can turn around a story of like this kind of magnitude. I thought it was, I'm forever grateful to you. And
we're grateful to you for bringing us the story. We wouldn't have known about it if not for you. So.
Well, maybe we can talk about the Jiu Jitsu story a little bit. If anyone has any questions about it, please feel free. This is the last, I think, 10 minutes before our talk is going to be over. But the Jiu Jitsu story, I know with it, I kind of stumbled across it on social media. And by the time I got the documentation to see what the like you said, what's the grand scope picture of this whole story, I realized it's a lot more for one person to handle. And if I was to do it on my own, it probably would have been 6 months of me trying to track down everyone, or maybe more than just, I think we did it in 2 months, or maybe less than.
Yeah, probably less. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the power of working together in teams, right. Stuff like that. I mean, that's another thing that time stresses is a lot of it. Even since I've been there, it seems like it's more prevalent now. You're working together in teams and you can get things, we also have an incredible research department at the Times that can help you get a hold of people that you might not otherwise find. And so, yeah, I think working with people, I enjoy it. I mean, I've been, especially in the last year or two, working with our young fellows, and I've really enjoyed that. It's energizing to work with younger reporters and who are just sort of starting out. They're not cynical, they're eager, and I like that. It's fun to do.
So was there anything from the Jiu Jitsu story that maybe was open-ended for you, or you thought maybe there's a little bit more to this than what people have seen in the story that maybe you want to share?
I don't know. Give me what are you thinking of? And maybe I can take off from there.
Well, I think for me, there was so much to that story that, because we were reporting it for the first time for mainstream media. However, like Jiu Jitsu Time has covered it, these niche blogs and online media had covered it for the longest time. And so it was like the first introduction of this particular issue. And I thought it was a lot of meat to cover, right? It's a lot of information. So from the first draft to the final product, there's a lot of stuff that maybe you got to get very fine-tuned. I realized it was very easy to go off into a tangent with that story.
Right. Yeah. I'm sort of interested from some of the stuff I read, just about what is it about the sport itself that allows this to happen? I mean, every sport is different and has its particular nature. But I maybe that's one thing about, because to be honest, I didn't really know anything about jiu-jitsu until we started working on the story. I would like to know, what is it about the culture of jiu-jitsu that permits this to go on, and the sort of lack. I mean, so one of the things about jiu-jitsu, one of the reasons it's not an Olympic sport, is because there's no central governing body. There are some governing bodies, but there's no one overarching governing body that has the ability to set the rules and discipline athletes and have the same uniform rules, the same kind of standardized drug testing. So it just exists in a very different groups that are doing their own thing. I'd like to know maybe a little more of that, sort of bore in more on what is it about this sport.
Yeah. And has anyone contacted you to follow up or in regards to the story, or do you usually get people that follow up with you and either ask you to look into this more?
A couple people have contacted us, myself and other people at the paper, about with sort of related ideas, I would say.
Yeah, right.
Maybe not specifically this story, but sort of related ideas. So, yeah.
And what do you has there ever been a story where you've gotten the feedback from the public saying, can you please look into this a little bit further, or there's something like this? Or has there been an instance where someone has come forward after a story has come out that kind of gave legs to a different,
so 20 years ago or so, I broke this huge story about sex abuse in figure skating. Mm-hmm. And it sort of opened the gate. So, I mean, there's been a steady stream of those kind of stories for 20 years since then. But that was a story that I have worked on since then, and many other reporters. Really, just it was kind of an open secret that what was going on. And then once I reported on it, then a lot of people picked up on it, and it's unfortunate we're still writing about it 20 years later. I mean, that sport. So figure skating, there's not a figure skating rink in every city in the country like there is a basketball court or something. So you have these young kids leaving home to train at a few of these made Olympic type training centers, and you often have, like in pair skating, younger women paired with older men, because they have to be lifted up in the air and thrown in the air. And so, it's often younger women. And so they're away from home, and, it sets it can be a precarious situation. So as I say, all these sports have their own flaws. And
Right.
I really like figure skating. It's a fascinating sport to cover because it's a mix of sport and art, but, it has some serious problems. As far as
Jere, what do you hope to be your legacy? What do you want people to remember you by when it comes to your career?
I was just telling somebody the other day, I have to say, I don't know that I would be remembered. I think, that most of our careers are I always say most of our careers are like sandcastles on the beach, and by the next high tide, it's washed away, and then there's no evidence that it existed. I mean, I don't know that I would be remembered by anybody, but I would just say that I did my best. I worked hard. I tried to be fair and accurate, and sympathetic. And, that's, basically, and I got to see the world. That's what I would say.
One thing we do with all of our guests, we always ask them, because our main theme here is international community, is press freedom. And so we want to ask you, what does press freedom mean to you?
Well, it means, just being able to go about your job. And again, I say that, all right, I work for an organization like the New York Times. So that allows me, when I go any place in the world, people have heard of the New York Times. So that, and so you have that kind of backing. So you feel free to sort of fearlessly go and do your job and not worry about, I mean, again, I haven't been in a situation where I've been arrested like some reporters have, or I haven't been imprisoned, as many reporters who are in much more dangerous situations than me. But it's the chance to go and do your job and let the chips fall where they may. I mean, I guess that's it. That's at its most basic.
So we're entering towards the end of our conversation. Is there anything you want to add, or something that we may not have discussed that you want to contribute before we kind of?
I think I would just say is just, stay in the business. You're going to be the leading, and people, especially people young and just starting out, you're the future. And nobody knows what the future will be. I mean, the Times has a research and development department, but even they don't know, right? I mean, so if you want to be a journalist, stick with it, because you'll be at the leading edge. As I say, you'll be cresting the wave of whatever plays out in journalism. That I would say, don't be discouraged. And then on the other hand, just be dedicated to reporting. Always make the next phone call. Don't be satisfied with just what you think of something, opinion. Do the work, do the
hard work,
find the news, and knock on doors,
make
phone calls. It's pretty basic stuff, but it really is. You just never know who's going to
experience. It becomes easier. At first, it can be very intimidating to even know where to go and how to do it, and do it with confidence, right? I think with experience.
Yeah, and it's I mean, there's no magic secret. I mean, you're always calling people or knocking on doors. And if you're, I mean, that's really the basic. You're calling lawyers, calling friends, calling associates, family members. I mean, that's really, it's fairly basic that you do. You just keep doing it over and over and over and over. And if you're a sports writer, the other thing I would say, don't become friends with these athletes. You're not, and don't be a fan of athletes. I mean, you can be a fan of a sport. You obviously want to like the sport if you're covering it, but you're not there to sort of cheerlead. So there's an old saying, there's no cheering in the press box. So maintain your distance.
That's such a great tip.
And believe me, the athletes will appreciate that too, as much as you will.
Right. That's perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jere, for joining us today. If there's any other questions that anyone may have, we have the next few minutes while I do the final introduction to our next talk. I wanted to announce that on Tuesday, November 2nd, we're going to be having Aisha Tanzim. She serves as the chief of Voice of America's Afghanistan and Pakistan Bureau, and she's based in Islamabad, Pakistan. She's one of the few foreign correspondents that's traveled in areas under the control and influence of the Islamic State militant group while it was at its peak of power in eastern Afghanistan in 2015. She's also been very active just a few months ago discussing the issues of journalists face under the new Taliban rule in the country. We're really looking forward to having her join us and speak with us more about this issue on November 2nd. We're going to be sending more information on how to join our talk in our weekly newsletter, so please make sure to keep an eye out for that. Jere, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you, and I cannot get enough of your stories. So maybe hopefully once you do your reporting on this story and the next, I know you have a few more coming in you're working on. So maybe we can have you back to tell us more about it.
Sure, happy to. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you on November 2nd. Thank you, Jere. Thank you all.
Take care, Al. Bye-bye.